Chaf Gimel Amid Beis 23b, and we just seen in the Mishnah, Machloka said, how large can a karpef be? How large of a space can a area that is not made specifically for dwelling? It is made for wood storage or well water or other or gina or garden. They're not made for living. How large can it be? And we saw that there's a base asayim, a two-seah area, planting area, which is 100 by 50 amma squared, which is about 70 and change, and 70 by 70 and change. And we saw machlokas in the Mishnah whether it has to be specifically squared. It can be rectangular at 100 by 50. Does it have to have a dwelling space in it, like a watchman's hut? Does it have to be have some sort of water pit or a cave or something? And so the Gemara brought two statements of Shmuel, one where he said the halach is like Rabbi Yossi, and one he said the halach is like Rabbi Akiva. And the Gemara we're up to is the tzrichasa. Why did he need to say these two halachas for leniency? Both of them are lenient, and we need them. Because if he had just said halach is like Rabbi Yossi, I may have thought that the requirement is that you have to have, besides for the enclosure, you also have to have some sort of dwelling space in there, even though it's not a typical living space, but it'll have at least a guard's house, a shomira, a beis dira, or some secondary dwelling spot. That's why we say Allah is like Rabbi Akiva, that you do not require that. And if he said that Allah is like Rabbi Akiva, that if it's rectangular, it would not be okay. It has to be completely squared. Kamash Malan, halacha Rabbi Yossi. That's why he said that halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. Now here we begin the halachas of a karpef, and we're going to need a bit of an introduction for the concept. Up until now, we've been dealing with a private domain that has an enclosure. It's a reshus hayachid that has mechitzos. It has an enclosure, and therefore you can carry within there. And if there are multiple dwelling spaces there, then you make an eruv. They share that space by joining in a meal, and then you can carry within there. We also saw the concept of a karmelis. A karmelis is a space that looks like a public domain, a public space, and therefore it's prohibited to carry in there, even though that it doesn't have the requisite definitions of a reshus harabim, of a public domain. Nevertheless, Chachamim prohibited carrying in there, and because it looks to, and the concept of people is that it's a public domain, such as an alleyway, and that requires some sort of enclosure. We're going to learn a halach over here, something that is a proper private domain, meaning it has the four boundaries, all sides, proper boundaries, and nevertheless, the Chachamim prohibited carrying in there, and that is where the enclosure is not made for private living or for personal living. It's not made for a place that people would dwell. And as such, even though that it is enclosed and it's a reshus hayachid, it's a private domain, nevertheless, it acts like a public domain, in as much as it's not made for living. It's a public space. It's an abnormal enclosure in that way, and therefore you can't carry in there. But there are definitions and limits, and that's what we're going to be looking at. Another important halacha that we have to know for this next section of the Gemara is, if I have a livable space, and next to it is a non-living space, a karmelis, which is maybe an alleyway, a lake, and something a semi-public space, a rabbinic public space, and next to it is my private courtyard or house, individual backyard, and it's open entirely. Paretz b'malua, the entire one side of my courtyard, my backyard, whatever it may be, is open to that prohibited to carry space. So the space that you're not allowed to carry in is open completely, and that would prohibit me carrying even in my own domain. On account of that, it's completely breached, completely open to the other space. That's called paretz b'maloa. It is open in its entirety to the other space. Now we're going to have a question that comes up is if I have a halachically permissible space to carry, such as my backyard, my front yard, and something like that, and next to it I either open up to, or I start planting or doing something there that makes it prohibited to carry. So I have a karpef, a space that I'm not allowed to carry in, and a permissible space to carry in, and they're open to each other. At what point do we say you can no longer carry in your permissible backyard because that's where you live, nevertheless, because it's open to the other space, you cannot? So that's the discussion we're going to get, and hopefully with that introduction, we can go into it. So karpef, this wood storage area, that's larger than the allowed space. As we saw in the Mishnah, the maximum you're allowed is a 70 by 70 or 50 by 100. And which is a 2-seah planting area. And your karpef is larger than that. It's enclosed, but the enclosure includes not only the wood storage area, but it also has hukaf ladira. It also has a dwelling space, meaning essentially you have your house. The backyard of your house, it has a door open from the house. So the enclosure there is made for living because it's open to your house. And part of your backyard is nice lawn and livable space, and in a part you have a karpef, a storage area, a non-living space that's larger than the allowed amount, but it is enclosed for a livable space. So that's going to be fine. Now what this person does is they plant vegetable garden there. And a vegetable garden is not a livable space because people don't want to walk there. People don't want to mess up the garden by walking through it. So it's designated specifically for non-living. And by the way, the Meiri says that that's not in our gardens that we have some shrubs in the front or maybe a flower pot or something like that. That's not what we're talking about, because obviously is specifically made to enhance the living space. We're talking about where if somebody has a homestead, and off to the side they have a little actual garden for planting with it, where they don't want people walking, and they don't want it to be a part of the living space. So hukav ladira, it was originally enclosed for the livable space, including the carpet, including the wood storage area. Nizra ruba, but now the majority of the space was turned into a garden, a vegetable garden. So now the entire space becomes like a garden, and you're not allowed to carry within there because it's a non-livable space, even though it's fully enclosed. Not aruba. However, if you didn't plant vegetables there, rather you planted an orchard there, you planted a bunch of fruit trees. That is like a courtyard, because people will, even if it's a fruit tree and it's made for fruits, people don't mind that you walk next to it and it's not going to ruin the trees, and therefore people actually will hang out underneath the tree. And therefore it's permissible to carry in there because it remains livable space. Nizra ruba. So Amar Rav Huna explains this concept of it all became planted, and that he planted the whole thing. Amar Rav Huna, this that the majority of the field of the backyard is planted, it has to be that not only is it the majority, but it is larger than the space of Beis Hasayim. It's larger than 70 by 70 or 100 by 50. Aval Beis Hasayim, but if it's exactly 50 by 100 or 70 by 70 and change, mutter, it's going to be permissible. And what's the reason for that? Even though that they're defined as two separate livable spaces, one is the backyard, and one is a garden. But since this garden is within the allowable amount, you're allowed to have up to 70 by 70 of a garden, or including 70. You can't have more than 70 by 70 or 100 by 50. But since this is an allowable amount, so even though that it's defined as a separate space, you have the garden space and you have the backyard space. But nevertheless, it's going to be permissible. Because Rabbi Shimon said, and we saw this early in the Masechta and in Shabbos, that Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that two spaces that have the same halachic status, even though that they are different in ownership or different in categorization, nevertheless, they're going to be permissible to be carried from one to the other. That means I have a courtyard and my rooftop. Both of them are going to be public space as much as that we live in a courtyard with five, six tenants. But so everybody has rights to the roof and everybody has rights to the courtyard. So even though that there are two designations, one is made for basic living and one is on the roof, but nevertheless you can carry from the roof to the courtyard and the courtyard to the garden. And even if they belong to two separate people, since they are the same category of private domain that has access to public and looks like public domain. So Kaman Rabbi Shimon, the Tanan, as we learned, Rabbi Shimon says, Achagagos, roofs, Echatzeros, and courtyards, Echat Karfifos, and wood storage areas, Rishus Achas Lekalim, Sheshavsuben. All the vessels that were in the courtyard may be carried to the roof, and vice versa. However, this that you require an eruv, meaning a joint meal, is only for vessels in the house to bring them to the courtyard, or vice versa. That's where it's prohibited. But the vessels that were in the courtyard, you can bring to the roof. The vessels that were on the roof, you can bring to the courtyard, because even though they're two separate spaces, they are the same halachic definition, and therefore you're allowed to carry from one to the other. So too over here in the courtyard, where you planted one part into a garden, since the maximum you're allowed to plant is this 100 by 50, or the base asayim, and you stayed within that limit, so it's a permissible place to carry. And in your courtyard, you're allowed to carry. And even though they're two different designations, one's a garden, one's a courtyard, nevertheless, you're allowed to carry from one to the other because, like Rabbi Shimon says, you can carry in these two designated areas. Kivan the Nizra Ruba Hava Humiyuta, since the majority was planted with a garden. So the Gemara says, wait, even according to Rabbi Shimon, that shouldn't be true, because we have a problem. The Rabbi Shimon Nami, even the Nizra Ruba, since you just said that the majority of the courtyard was planted for vegetables. So even though it's true, you still have a space that's livable and not garden, but that should be nullified to the majority. Even the Nizra Ruba Havahumi Uta, and now we switch to Chavdal and Aleph to 24a, Bata Lagabe Ruba, that should be nullified to the majority. And then it's going to be a non-living dwelling space, enclosure that's a karpef, which is the general term we use for all these non-living space enclosures, like a wood storage area, a garden, a lake, etc. So havale karpef yosef beis asayim v'aser, and it's going to be prohibited. So the Gemara is going to try a second version of what Rav Huna would have said. If Rav Huna said it, this is the way he said it. Hamiyuta shari, that if the minority of the courtyard was planted with vegetables, it's going to be permissible to carry in the courtyard, even though there is a vegetable patch there. You can carry it since the enclosure was made for dwelling, because it's open to the house. So it's an enclosure made for dwelling. If the majority is dwelling and the minority is turned into a vegetable patch, then you're allowed to continue carrying in there. Amar Rav Huna b'Rei Yeshua, and to that Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, said, however, it must be that minority area is only going to be up to 100 by 50 or 70 by 70, a base aside. But if it actually is a base aside, if it's that maximum size, it's going to be prohibited, because now it's defined as its own space. If it's less than base asayim, if it's less than the full amount that we mentioned before, the size of the courtyard of the Mishkan, well then that section is just a part of the courtyard, about part of the backyard. However, once it becomes the size of a base asayim, it becomes 100 by 50 or 70 by 70 and change, well, then now it is actually its own defined space. And it's true that that it's a minority of the backyard. But since it's its own defined space, you cannot carry from your backyard into the other yard and vice versa, into the garden and vice versa. And then it's going to be defined as a courtyard that is open on one side completely to a prohibited space, which we mentioned in our introduction, that's going to prohibit. If I have within my backyard, even though that the enclosure is there, but since they are defined as two separate spaces, So my backyard living space is separate from the garden space, and the garden space I'm not allowed to carry in. So then it's as if I have a breach in my wall, because one side of my backyard is open to a prohibited space that I can't carry to and from. And this would be in the based on the opinion of the Rabbanan, not like Rabbi Shimon. Because according to Rabbi Shimon, we said two designated spaces still will you're allowed to carry from one to the other because they both are in the same category of backyards. So just like your roof and your backyard, you're allowed to carry from. So to your yard and your garden and your vegetable patch, you're allowed to carry to and from. However, the Chachamim will say that you're not allowed to carry from the roof to the backyard, or also going to say you're not allowed to carry from your backyard to the garden patch. Rabbi Yirmi Medifti Masni Lakula. However, Rabbi Yirmi of Difti, he actually teaches this teaching of Rav Huna Bered Rishua to the opposite way, in leniency. Hami Utashar, that if it was a minority space in the backyard, that means the majority of your backyard remains livable space, just usable for your daily living. And your garden, which essentially you don't want to walk in and out of because you want the vegetables to grow well, that remains a separate spot and a separate patch. However, according to Rabbi Shimon, you can carry from one patch to the other, because he holds that just like from the roof and the courtyard, which have two separate designations, but they are halachically the same domain space. So therefore, you can carry from one to the other. So too within the from the vegetable patch to your backyard, and vice versa. However, it's only up to a Beis Hasayim, Ella Beis Hasayim, Aviyosem a Beis Hasayim. But if it's larger than that, which now you're not allowed to have a garden larger than Beis Hasayim, than 100 by 50, because if it's larger than that, an enclosure no longer works for it, as we've seen that the maximum size enclosure you're allowed to have for a wood storage area or a garden that's not made for livable space is Beis Hasayim. So if it's larger, now it's a prohibited spot. And if it's a prohibited spot and your backyard is open to it entirely on one side, it's going to be prohibited. So to conclude, this is the idea. We have three opinions of what Rav Huna said, but the concept is the same. If you have a karpef, a backyard, which is regular livable space, and next to it you have a garden, which is a non-livable space. And again, as we mentioned from the Meiri, and we're not talking about gardens that are there to enhance our living space, like shrubs and maybe a little vegetable boxes and so on. We're talking about somebody who built a homesteader who built an actual vegetable garden in part of their backyard. If that's not separately enclosed, it's open to the livable backyard. So either by its majority, or even if it's minority, it's larger than Beis Hasayim. Rabbi Shimon's going to say, since they are open to one another, it's going to prohibit to carry even in the livable space, because a livable space is now open to a prohibited area. However, the Chachamim are stricter, and they're going to say one step further. Even if it's exactly the size of a Beis Hasayim, which is the max limit that you're allowed to have such a vegetable garden. But since it's defined as a separate space, you're not allowed to carry from two separate spaces, even though they have the same halachic domain definition. But since they are separate spaces, because they have separate halachic qualifications, you're not allowed to carry from one to the other.
Well, the limitation in space. Let's say you had 500 of backyard, and is it that 200 of it could, more than 200 of it is being a carpe for being so like that would disqualify, or is it the sachakol with the livable and the carpe has to be under 200?
No, my livable space.
I'm not 200.
Thousands.
Two saw.
Yeah, no. The two sea planting area is the prohibited area, is the new definition area. Your vegetable garden, your wood storage space, whatever it may be, off to the side is up to 100 by 50 amma.
So if I live in Buckingham Palace and there's like 20 acres of gorgeous lawn where I could wander and walk, that doesn't matter. But if there's more than 2 saw of wood pile, that's going to invalidate the entire invalidate the entire grounds of that is that right?
Right, that's what
If
I'm
it's
discussing. And
if it's
various
attached.
variations as to when it wouldn't prohibit, but yes, that's the
But if
concept.
it's attached, okay.
I have a big, large backyard, maybe 10,000 square amma, and my 5,000 square amma patch is off to the side. It's a minority of my backyard, but it's a 5,000 square amma, which is 100 by 50, right? So it's my 5,000 square amma of vegetable garden off to the side. Since it's not enclosed separately, it's all open to one another, it's going to be prohibited in whatever variation we just saw, 3 versions. Okay, so Gemara says further. However, if you planted it as a orchard, trees, that would be okay because people love living under trees and walking there, and that remains livable space. There's no restrictions that people put on walking through a orchard because it doesn't damage the trees. But walking through a vegetable patch, you could ruin it, and so there's no walking through there. So that's off limits, and that's why it's not livable space. Trees are livable space. Amar Rav Avimi, in the name of Avimi, he said, "V'husha asuin etztablois." That's only if it's actually a nice, neat rose. It looks nice. It's made for livable space. However, if it's just a hodgepodge of trees, that's going to be prohibited. No, even if it's not in rows, even if it's just a bunch of trees all around, it's going to be permissible either way because it doesn't damage the tree, so you're allowed to live there, and so people it's still part of livable space. Mar Yehuda came to the house of Rav Huna Bar Yehuda. He saw these trees in the backyard that were planted. So the backyard was full of trees, basically an orchard, but it was not neat in rows. Yet they were carrying within there. Don't you follow the opinion of Avimi, who says that it has to be neat in its tablois? He says, no, I follow the opinion of Reb Nachman, who says that even if it's not neat rows. Amar Nachman Amar Shmuel. Another statement of Nachman in the name of Shmuel. A karpef, which is this wood storage area, that's larger than the maximum amount allowed, which is 100 by 50, base aside. And as opposed to the previous discussion, which was that the enclosure was there that included livable space, and therefore you're allowed to carry in there, even though it's beyond the max for the wood storage area, since it's made for livable space, that's okay, as opposed to a garden where it would negate it. The wood storage area is going to be okay as long as it's also an enclosure for living, meaning your house is open to there. And now you want to change this. So how do you change it? So how do you fix it? So you have to break down one of the walls of your enclosure, of your backyard fence, in an area larger than 10 amas. So you have to break out more than 15 feet, let's say. So let's say 16 feet or 17 feet. You break some of the wall. Now it's not enclosed at all because the max gap you're allowed in a barrier of a courtyard or a backyard is 10 amos. Beyond that, you're going to need a door frame. So you, by breaking this down, you have just negated the entire fencing around it halachically. Okay, now you can start again. So what you do is v'godra mamida al eser, and now you refence it and you close it up to max that the gap is max 10 amos. So now it's a proper fence, and now you've done it where you've fenced it in with the intent of living there, such as, let's say, beforehand you didn't have a door from your house to that backyard area, and now you've opened that door. So now, and then you fix the fence, so refence the backyard. So now the enclosure that you make by refencing is an enclosure made for dwelling because you already have a door to your backyard, and that's going to be permissible. So the Gemara asks a question. Okay, so you said I have to break an opening of 10 amos, more than 10 amos, and then when I close that, when I refence it, I'm making the enclosure with the proper intent of living in there. Great. What happens if I don't do it all at once? So let's say the north wall of my backyard is 20 amas. I'm going to make a 10 amma breach, but I don't want it to be open too much. I don't want people looking in. I don't want it to be, so vulnerable. So I'm going to do is I'm going to break 1 amma at the corner, and then I re-fence it, and then I break an amma, the second amma in from the corner, and then I re-fence it, and then I break a 3rd amma in, and I re-fence it. So by the time we're done, the entire 10 amas are a new fence. So I've re-fenced that with the proper intent. However, at no time was there a gap of 10. He replayed, maybe he redid the entire fencing, but at no point was it completely breached. So what's the halacha now? Amar Lesi said to him, isn't that similar to what we've learned? All vessels that are private owned vessels, if it has a hole in it, you're not going to toss it yet. People couldn't afford vessels that much, and so if it had a break, a crack, a hole, that just meant that I'm going to use it for something larger. So let's say it had a small hole, so I can't use it for liquids. I'll use it for flour. I can't use it for flour because it's a larger hole. I'm going to use it for grains. I can't use it for grains because even they fall out because it's a larger hole. Fine, so I'll use it for dates and figs. It's so large that I can't even use it for that. I'll use it for pomegranates. However, if it's so large that even pomegranates will fall out, at that point it's no longer a vessel. I don't have usage for it in the house, and it becomes a null and void. We've seen this multiple times, and this is relevant to the laws of Tuma. If my vessel became Tameh, I have to, earthenware vessel, I have to undo it. I have to break it. When I break this vessel, when it has a hole the size of a rimon, of a kamotzi rimon, a pomegranate size, so now it's no longer usable. It's no longer considered a vessel, and as such, it is null and void, and the tuma it dissipates. Chizkiah asked a question: what happens if I didn't make a hole that large at once, or rather, I made a lot of small holes and I filled each one subsequently? So I took an olive-size hole out, drilled an olive-size hole in the vessel, and then I susma and I filled it. And again another olive size. And by the time I'm done, I've replaced an area that's the size of a pomegranate size. What's Allah? And Rabbi Yochanan responded, Rebbe taught us this halacha. Sandal. The halacha is if your shoe, which is a leather vessel, became tameh. So somebody who had a tumah coming out of his body and wore this shoe, so he stepped on it. So there's a tumah concept that we learned about midras, a tumah of pressure. So every time there's a vessel there, every time he uses the shoe, that becomes tameh again. Sandal shenipsakachas meyazna, and one of the ears. So basically, these are the flaps that you use to put the shoelace through. So those flaps are called ears. So you have basically the sole and a little bit of side of the shoe, and then you have these flaps that come over the top, and you tie those together with the strap. So if one of them rips off, and he fixed it. So it ripped off, and he fixed one. Tell me, it remains in the same tumah status because it's still the same original vessel. So the pressure from having walked on it is going to be tummy. Nifsika shnia. However, if the second one rips as well, v'tikna, and he fixes that one as well, tor min midras. It no longer has the original tumah of midras, of pressure, and now only has a tumah of touch. Maga midras. It is tummy of the touch that it had before. Now, in any case, leaving aside the tumah aspects of why that tumah remains and this one's gone, which we talked about already in Brachos and in Shabbos, here, just for what we need is this concept that having replaced one of these ears, one of these flaps, that is not enough to change the vessel. But even though you've replaced one and now you replace the other, it's going to be tummy. It's no longer tummy. It changed its status from before. And the Gemara says, "Va'amris Allah ma'ishna rishona." Why is the first one, when the first one ripped and you fixed it, it still retains its original tuma status. We say, okay, you just fixed one ear, but one of these flaps, but the rest of the shoe is the original vessel. Because the second flap is still there. By the time you tore the second one, the first one's already fixed. So when you tore the second one, what did you do? You tore one flap in an intact shoe. And so it should not be considered negating the previous shoe in the previous vessel. And he explained to us, Allah, this at this point, you have a new shoe. If you replace so many parts of your car, it's no longer the original car. If you replace so many parts of your shoe, it's no longer the original shoe. Even though that when you replace each part, the rest of it was still intact. But cumulatively, you've now replaced enough that the original is no longer there. So too with the fencing. If you replace each amma alone, by the time you're done, the 10 amma plus, you've replaced enough to say this is a new enclosure. And this enclosure was built with the intent of living here because we already have a door from the house into there. Kari aleh. So he said, oh, that's such a wonderful proof and such a wonderful concept and idea. Les den bar inush. This is not a human. This is an angel. What a genius idea. Somebody say he didn't say that. What he said is kedgun den bar nash. This is the way a human should think. This is a proper person. Either way, he was impressed with the comparison and the concept of seeing that ultimately, cumulatively, you have enough change in the fence to define it as a new halachic space. Amrav Kahana, Rechavesh Acharei Abati, your back patio area, Ein metaltalin boy eladal amos. You're only allowed to carry 4 amos within there. You're not allowed to carry throughout the whole thing, since, as we'll see in a moment, that it's talking about a patio that doesn't have a door to your house. So it really is just like a storage area that you have to walk around from the front to the backyard to get something, and it's got a separate enclosure, but it's an enclosure not for livable space. And therefore, you cannot carry within there more than 4 amos, just in the space of whatever the vessel is. However, Rav Nachman says in Pasach lePesach mutar l'taltel b'kulah. If you open an opening from your house to that patio, so now it's a livable space because you're going to go in and out, and therefore you're allowed to carry in the entire backyard. Pasach matirei.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Kind of off topic, sort of on topic.
Okay.
So you bought the whole city of Portland, but
Yeah.
did you
Southwest
buy
Portland, by the way.
Southwest Portland? So did you buy just the streets, or did you buy like the front lawn of my house that goes onto the street? Is that
The idea
that's
is
it's private space, but it's not mukaf, but it's. You hear what I'm asking?
Yeah, the idea is by buying from powers that have eminent domain, that have the theoretical possibility of for public use redesignating space. So essentially, we tap into that space. So Michael is asking, how in a courtyard we understand everybody lives in one courtyard. And by sharing a meal in the courtyard, we buy buy into a shared space that we already share. Whereas when we make an Eruv in a city, there are many people that have private property. But by going to a power that has eminent domain, which means that they have the potential right for public rights, for public need, to redesignate private space at a cost, but nevertheless, they can redesignate private space into public space. And so essentially we're buying all right-of-way and potential right-of-way. That's what an Eruv does. So it's right now only the right-of-way, but it gets into the shared space of all potential right-of-way.
Oh. They could condemn it if they wanted to.
Right, within whatever the confines of the law is, but it has that possibility. So that's the ultimate power within that private space. And we'll see more about that later when we get to the actual sharing of space. But right now, back to the backyard, right? So we started off with a back patio that was enclosed, but since there was no door from the house to that back patio, it's not an enclosure for living space. And since it's larger than the maximum allowable space of Beis Hasayim, 100 by 50 or 70 by 70, so you cannot carry in there more than within the four amos of the space of where that item is. However, once you open the opening, it's going to be permissible. So Gemara says, Pasach matiroi v'le'amrin, if you open, it makes it permissible. However, but it has to be that you first opened the door and then made the enclosure. But if you first made the enclosure, you fenced in your backyard before you opened the door from your house to the backyard. When you open your door to the backyard, the enclosure has already been made for non-living space because you didn't have access to it from your house. So what you're going to have to do, like we said before, you're going to have to breach some of the wall and replace it to create a new enclosure with the intent of dwelling. But if you first enclose it and then open, look, that's not going to be good. So Gemara says, if you first open and then enclose it, of course that's going to be okay. It's not a carpet. It actually is just like your front yard. Pshita. No, so what we're talking about, there's a silo or a wheat pile behind the house, enclosed within the back patio. I may think that your enclosure, your fencing, is made not for the livable space, but for the non-livable space, for the silo and for the silo is actually going to be a self-contained halachic space, but for your grain piles, and therefore it's not going to count as a proper backyard, and halachically it's not livable space. That's why at Kamash Malan that it does count as a livable space. So you had a back storage area which was made for essentially not living space. It was larger than Beis Hasayim, but it had a door to your backyard, so it was essentially considered enclosed for livable space because it has this opening to your house. And and now it filled. It got filled with water. Just like a garden is not, nobody walks there. It's not made for a living, and therefore it loses its backyard status. So too, water. Nobody walks there. It's filled with water. It's not going to count as a backyard. This is what Rava said. Water is actually like planting an orchard there, not like planting a garden there, and it's permissible. However, it has to be that the water that your backyard got filled with is actually either spring water or rainwater that's clean, and therefore it's usable for the house. It's usable for daily living. You can drink from it and so on. But if it's muddy, dirty water that you're not going to be able to use, so that actually is not livable. It's like a garden. So again, this is the same as the distinction between the trees and the garden. The garden, nobody wants anybody walking through their garden because it messes up. It can kill the plants. It can ruin it, and so it's off limits. So it's a non-livable space. Whereas an orchard, go ahead, walk in there. It's actually pleasant. It's nice, and so it is livable space. Same goes with water. If the backyard, which is supposed to be livable space, gets filled with water that's drinkable, it's usable for human consumption, it's usable for the household living, so then it's going to be defined as a livable space because that's beneficial to the dwelling space. Just like trees However, if it's non-usable water, so it's like a garden, it's not livable space. And again, the concept is, the definition has to be that this is made for inhabitants of the house. It's made for daily living. It's made for a domestic use, as opposed to a garden or a field, storage area, grain storage area. These are spaces that you only go to when you need, and it's not where you lounge around. It's not where your domestic living is. But if you cannot use the water, it's not going to be good. And even if the water is actually usable, it has to be that in the depth of water, wherever your big puddle doesn't cover 100 by 50 or 70 by 70, because if it does, then that's going to be its own space. How deep are we talking about that it's going to be this large puddle? Rashi says it needs to be 10 tefachim deep. So you're going to have 10 tefachim, a 30-inch deep, 5,000 square amma space. So that's really like a lake in your backyard. And if it becomes that large, it doesn't make a difference, even if it is drinkable water, it's water that you can use. It's no longer a livable space, because that now is defined as its own domain. But if the 10 tefachim deep, there's more than 100 by 50 or 70 by 70, also it's going to be prohibited. To which the Gemara says, V'lav miltzi. But that's not true, because it can be even that large. It's still going to be permissible. Because just like a silo, not a silo, a pile of grains, of produce, which is 10 tefachim high, and it's going to be an enormous size of 50 by 100 or more, it doesn't remove the status of livable space there, because they are part of your daily living. You go there and you get the produce when you need it, and it's open to your house, and so therefore it retains its livable space. So to water, as long as it is drinkable, as long as it is good water, even if it's a huge lake in your backyard, it's 5,000 square amma, it's 50 by 100, which is about 75 feet by 150 feet. So it's a pretty large space. Nevertheless, it's going to be permissible to carry within that courtyard, within that backyard, because it is a part of livable space, because you can use it for your daily living. And so he disagrees with the limitation of space, as long as the water is usable for a living. You know, we're going to get this. We're going to have to do this tomorrow out of time. We're going to see about a yard, this backyard that was open one side to the river, one side it was open to a vineyard, and the halacha of what those boundaries and the cross between the boundaries are.